There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Mahoney moves to amend Senate File Number 3656. The second Grossman has amended, and the amendment is coded A21.
I recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney, to your bill. Excuse me, to your
Thank you,
amendment.
Mr. Speaker, and I will call for a roll call on this.
Roll call being requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this amendment does is restores the funding to the Minnesota Investment Fund and the Job Creation Fund. In Representative Garofalo's bill, we take $12 million out, $13 million out. And all this amendment does, is allow the Department of Employment and Economic Development to continue to help businesses grow in the state of Minnesota. And just recently, they helped businesses grow. Let's see, I'll name a few of them because I actually have it written down, which is a violation of the House rules. I shouldn't be writing it down and then reading it, but I'm going to. Arctic Cat, DigiKey, Cirrus in Duluth, Ice Castle in Grand Rapids, Pork Prime in Windham. There's one in Owatonna, Advanced Extrusions in Rogers, Land O'Lakes in Arden Hills, Polaris in Plymouth. These dollars are the small dollars that we help small businesses expand and go from little businesses to mid-sized businesses. These are the dollars that help companies get started in Minnesota, whether they're in the metro area or the rural area. And by the way, it's about a 49-51% split. 49% go in the greater Minnesota, and 51% go in the metro area. And that's in 14-county metro area, excluding the Wisconsin ones. So members, MIF and job creation are the lifeblood of small and mid-sized businesses. It's the oddity that we use this fund for a company like DigiKey. But when we have to have that opportunity with this bill today, it won't be there. Please vote green for this amendment.
The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would urge members to vote no on the A21 amendment. The committee was very strong this year on the fact that with our state having low unemployment rates of 3.1 and 3.2%, there are better uses for this money than providing corporate subsidies to individual businesses. By voting for the Mahoney amendment, you are actually making less money available for health care, education, and the environment. I would urge a no vote.
Further discussion, Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Garofalo, please. We know that you heard from these businesses. We know they are big businesses. They don't want small businesses to start up. They don't want the competition from mid-sized because then they're forced to buy them at an inflated price. So what you're doing is helping corporate America continue to keep the small businessman down. You are not helping education. You are not helping healthcare. You are not helping anything else because you spent all the money in this bill. You spent every dime of that $13 million in the bill. So if you're going to try to refute me, please be honest. I would appreciate that because it's such a rarity between you and I.
The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Mahoney, just to be clear, we're talking about the tails. You're trying to restore the spending in the tails, not in the current biennium. You're correct that we are repurposing those dollars in the current biennium, but in the tails, in fact, actually, I am right. So I'll just, again, please vote no.
Further discussion? Seeing none, a roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 54 ayes and 70 noes, the amendment fails. It is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Moran moves to amend Senate File Number 3656. The second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A22.
I recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Moran, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members, this is a good amendment. It is a bill that we heard in the Jobs and Energy, and it's a very simple bill that prohibits potential employers asking about previous pay. So women are participating in the workforce at 67% in the state of Minnesota. We are ranked second in the country. We have data that shows that Minnesota can do better to create more economic opportunities and pathways to prosperity for its girls and women. The wage gap continues to shortchange women regardless of education, age, race, ethnicity, or region of the state. Women remain clustered in low-wage work with little or no benefits, representing 2/3 of those in the state earning at or below the minimum wage, and continuing to be the majority of those living below the poverty line. While Minnesota continues to be a national leader in women workforce participation, and women earn a majority of all post-secondary degrees, these changes have not translated into economic equality. At the same time, support of caregiving, including affordable quality child care, has grown especially increasingly out of reach, even for those in the middle class. So what we know is this, that white women currently earns 82 cents for every dollar earned by a man, a white male, with comparable qualification and experience. What we also know is that if you are African American, Native American, or Asian American, you're making somewhere around 60+ cents to the dollar. And if you are Latina, you are making around 57 cents. Gender discrimination has been illegal since 1969, but the wage gap persists. The problem is that when a woman receives a lower wage for equal work, this lower wage can and do follow her for the rest of her life. This amendment won't solve the wage gap, but it is an important step. This amendment will help put women on equal economic footing as men. Some private employers have prohibited asking questions about previous salaries, like Amazon, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Employers would still be permitted to ask an applicant about their wage expectation. This amendment will also benefit anyone, including men. Men who want to take a lower paying job later in their career. Currently, their salary history will screen them out. If employers want to avoid wasting time for potential applicants who would not be interested in jobs where the pay that is unacceptably low, they can simply include the wage or salary range in the ads for the job opening. It's as simple as that. The only reason to oppose this amendment is to give employers an advantage when they negotiate wage and salary with a potential employee. Members, Speaker, Minnesota deserves this forward-moving legislation that supports families, and I hope that I can have the support of this body, and I would like to do a roll call.
The roll call being requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion to the amendment. Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would ask for a no vote on this amendment. The committee did hear this bill when it was offered by Representative Thiessen, and the majority of the committee voted to not progress the bill forward. I like the author, but again, this subject matter needs a little bit more research and more hearing time. I would ask members to vote no and oppose the bill.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill, or this amendment, does have civil penalties in it, and for that reason, I would oppose adoption of this amendment. It needs to come to the Civil Law Committee. Thank you.
Member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Garofalo, for you to stand up and say that this bill needs more time in committee, why didn't you give it to it? This is an important issue for all people, but particularly for women. Women get the short end of the stick every time when they go to apply for a job because they always get told, what was your salary request from last time? I am very frustrated. I'm trying to be calm because I've got another amendment coming up that I'm going to really enjoy. And I don't want to get lit up yet. But for you to stand there and say it needs more work, you had all this time in committee to have this work on this. But yet we had all the time in the world for energy issues. And I think it would have stood up in Representatives, the Civil Law Committee. So that's an invalid excuse.
Representative Moran.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. So, Representative Scott, it does not have any civil penalties. That was a secondary amendment that we did not put through. But I want to just talk a little bit about more research on this issue. This type of legislation is moving across the country right now. We've had legislation moving in Oregon, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, California, New York City. It is moving. I don't know if you guys received a handout about from the Washington Post about courts employers cannot pay women less because of their salary history. I want you to take a look at that because a federal appeals court ruled in April of 2018 that employers cannot justify paying a woman less than a man doing similar work because of her salary history. A MOVE advocate says will help close the wage gap between the sexes. This is needed. Women are in the workforce at really, really high numbers. The U.S. Court of Appeals from the 9th District sided with the California math consultant at the Center of Rizzo and Fresno County Office of Education, which argued that considering prior compensation when setting a worker's pay, that it perpetuates gender disparities and defines the spirit of the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Pay Act stands for a principle as simple as it is just, that men and women should receive equal pay for equal work regardless of the sex. The question before us is also simple. Can an employer justify a wage differential between male and female employees by relying on prior wages? Based on the text and the history and the purpose of the Equal Pay Act, the answer is a clear no. So there was a case that was in court by a young woman who was a trained educator on how to better teach math, who sued her employer of 3 years, the Fresno County Office of Education, in 2012 after learning that her colleagues made significantly more money than she, despite they had less experience. In court, Rizzo implored. He admitted that her salary was lower, and he argued that the discrepancy stems from her prior salary, which he asserted had nothing to do with her gender. Members, you know, I really, really wish that we didn't have to, you know, make these type of exceptions. I really wish that we can look at women, see their value and what they bring into the workforce, and just pay them the same equal wage as a male. But it doesn't happen. And often enough, the predictor of, you know, getting a new job is going before an employer who asks the question, what was your last pay? And from that, they are determining what that pay at that new job can be for that individual. And often women are starting at a disadvantage. They're starting at a lower pay, and that lower pay follows them from job to job throughout their life. And we're always at a disadvantage. So I heard Representative Garofalo, but I'm hoping you can reconsider. There's lots of data, lots of facts. It's a wave of states saying, you know, how do we create economic opportunity and prosperity for women? And this is one of those ways we can do that.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to correct the record on a couple of things. First of all, Representative Garofalo did give this bill a hearing. It was fairly lengthy, so it wasn't something that was short and rushed through. I think everybody got to answer the questions that they wanted to, or ask the questions that they wanted to have asked, and then they were answered. Representative Moran, on line 1.7 of the amendment, one of the things, another reason that I oppose this amendment is creating a new chapter, which is not even in this, in the Omnibus bill. But so you're creating chapter 181.173, and on line 1.7, that is where it references the civil penalties. So there are civil penalties to this amendment if it would be adopted. Thank you.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knoblach.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Representative Moran, I know you mean well and are doing what you think is best on this, and I agree with what your motives are, but I do see a few problems with the way this is written. First of all, there's been a lot of talk about how we're treating women in the bill and how this is a bill to try to make sure that women get the pay that they should have coming to them, but there is nothing specifically in this bill about women. I mean, it applies to everyone. But members, I'd have you look at two areas. First of all, if you look at page 1, lines 17 through 19, there's a definition of wage. And, you know, we're talking about, well, it's against the law if this passes to seek out wage history about past wages. But the definition of wage, if you look at page 1, lines 17 through 19, quote, does not include any objective measure of a prospective employee's productivity, including revenue generated for a current or former employer, sales, or other production reports. What does that mean? Well, it's okay to ask how much money a salesperson was making at their last job if they were on commission, but it's not okay to ask apparently how much a secretary was making. It's okay, excuse me, it's okay to ask how much money someone who's paid at a piece rate on a production line was making, because that's based on production reports, but it's not okay to ask someone who was working in the same place, who was paid by the hour, maybe even doing the same job, how much they were making. Beyond that, you know, we've got a prohibition about seeking past wage history. I mean, I've been involved in business where, as a person not at the top, a middle manager, I've seen people try to justify a higher wage for people in different jobs. I've seen people come and say, you know, we're trying to hire this person who's a software developer and your boss says, no, we just can't afford that much, and you want to go out and say, look, no, they're worth more. This is what they were making before. We should pay them more. We should offer them more. Your bill would prevent people from doing that. And I know that's probably not what you mean to have happen, but I can see this having some ill effects too. And so, members, I appreciate what you're trying to do, Representative Moran. I know your heart's in the right place, but I see some problems with this in the way it's written.
The member from Hennepin, Minority Leader Hortman.
I know you mean well. I can't even. Representative Knoblach, Representative Moran has presented information to the body establishing the fact of discrimination that results from employers asking about salary history. She has put in front of you the findings from a federal district court that analyzed evidence that established that discrimination takes place when this question is asked. This is a very simple vote, members. This amendment is about whether or not you think women should be paid equally to men.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knoblach.
Mr. Speaker, members, I just have to reply by saying there's no language in here whatsoever that talks specifically about women. And yes, I believe that discrimination does take place. And I believe that I believe the discrimination that Representative Moran talked about, that does take place. But I'm also pointing out there are some other pernicious effects to the bill in the way it's written that are going to actually, I think, cost people wages.
Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the fact that you don't believe data or that you don't like data doesn't mean that there isn't data to establish facts. The facts have been clearly established by the social science on this topic and found to be valid by courts of law in this country. So you may not like the facts and the data, Representative Knoblach, but that doesn't mean that there aren't facts and data establishing that this very question results in gender discrimination. So if we can reduce gender discrimination by not asking this question, why would we not do that?
The member from Martin, Representative Gunther.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Moran. I agree with a lot of things you were saying, but one thing is different today than it was perhaps 2, 4, 6, 8 years ago. We have 0.8 or 0.9 workers for the jobs we have open. And right now, employers are so desperate for workers. Every place you go, there's a help wanted sign. They're looking at their competitors, looking at other businesses with the kind of job sets they need, and they are competing against each other by offering them more money. This happened before and it's happening right now. So as far as gender differences, I don't think they're going to be as big as they would have been. I know in Jackson, Minnesota, Rosie the Riveter truly is there, and she gets paid as much as anybody else. I checked on that. And I really believe that in order to get employees today, employers have to bid more. Minimum wage is going to be less consequential every day. We're going into a great period of time when until we get more people in jobs, employers are going to have to bid more. I know in Fairmont, where I live, they could fill 400 jobs tomorrow with one industry, and they're paying $16.80 an hour, and that's in Greater Minnesota where they make 40% less than they do here. So those are the things that I'm concerned with. I don't think today is the time we have to worry about this. I think we have to enjoy these times, and hopefully we don't have to worry about what salaries they got before, because that's inconsequential anymore.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Gunther, I admire where you're coming from. But let's say, for instance, that that I go for a job interview, right? We're not just looking at minimum wage jobs or trying to take jobs from other people or asking for excess. That's not what we're doing here. But I go in for an interview, right? And let's just think that the employer has an idea of how much he wants to pay that employee, right? It may be a job that's going to pay $40,000 a year. But then he asks this question of this individual, and we know women always start off on the short end. And she said, well, my last job, I was making $32,000. And he says, well, I give you 34. Right? He gives her 34. And so what we're just saying is don't ask that question. Base it on her education, her experience, her expertise, and everyone else he has hired in that job who came in with that experience. Just don't ask that question. And base it on other factors. Just as simple as that.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative Gunther.
the other factors are those employers are desperate for workers today. And they are willing to pay more than they ever did before. And just like I said, in Fairmont, where the cost of living is 40% less than it is here, and the wages are 40% less than they are here, the best thing you can do is go down there and get a $17 an hour job in Fairmont, Minnesota, and you'll be living a lot better than you are here because those houses don't cost as much as they do in Mahoney's neighborhood.
Further discussion? Seeing none, a roll call being requested. Clerk will take the roll on the A22 amendment. Clerk will close the roll. Fenton votes no. Pawlowski votes aye. Lean votes aye. There being 52 ayes and 73 nays, the amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Zerwas moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A24.
I recognize the member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we saw this amendment the other night, and it was ruled not germane to the public safety omnibus bill. This is an amendment that is the language of a bill that I'm carrying dealing with PTSD and presumption for police and firefighters. And members, we started the discussion a little bit the other night, but I want to let you know some background on the amendment and on the underlying bill. The bill comes from the idea that what we have is we have series of public safety officials, police officers, firefighters, that on their day-to-day work, we ask that they go to calls, go to traffic accidents, respond to the worst things that people in our society have to see on a day-to-day basis. And in a basic course of doing their job, a job that they swore an oath to do, they experience some of the most traumatic incidents in our society. And so, members, under current law, we cover post-traumatic stress disorder after it's been diagnosed by a clinician for our police officers and firefighters. If they can prove that their PTSD diagnosis was in fact caused by an experience work-related. And so what ends up happening, members, all across the state of Minnesota, is you have police officers or firefighters or paramedics that endure unbelievable trauma, suffer, eventually are convinced to seek help, receive a PTSD diagnosis, and then need to begin the work comp procedures. And then, members, the state of Minnesota, if it's a state patrol trooper, a county board, and the attorneys for the Minnesota County Insurance Trust, or a city council and their attorneys, if it's a local police officer, municipal police officer, and the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust, time and time again, they say no. Prove it. Prove that your PTSD is related to your work. Which fatal motor vehicle accident caused your PTSD? Oh, you've been investigating child pornography and child pedophilia rings for the last 5 years? Which 14-hour day doing computer forensics work, looking and investigating child pornography, which day, which image caused your post-traumatic stress? And then the other questions start to come. Well, we do know you got divorced. We do know that you've been drinking a little bit lately. You seem a little off. Do you think your family problems are causing your PTSD? And we put police officers, state troopers, our prison guards, our local police officers, and our sheriff's deputies in a position, members, of having to prove that their clinically diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis is caused by the trauma experienced on the job. Members, it's important to understand that for over 25 years, we've already included in state statute presumptions for police officers and firefighters. If a police officer has a cardiac event and falls ill from a cardiac event or a heart attack while on the job, it is presumed in state statute that that is work-related. If a firefighter develops cancer, it is in state law a presumption, it is presumed that that cancer diagnosis is related to their work on the job. Members, We know so much more about PTSD now than even just 5 years ago, let alone over 25 years ago when the last presumption was added. We know the signs, the symptoms, and we understand better the causes. We must support our firefighters and our police officers. If at any point we have an emergency and we need help, we will dial 911 and they will come to help us. Members, year after year, they fall ill and they look to us, and now they're calling on us to help them. It's time we have their back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker?
Representative Pinto, for what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move a call of the House.
Seeing 10 hands, there will be a call of the House. Clerk will take the roll.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that further proceedings under the roll call be dispensed with and that the Sergeant at Arms be instructed to bring in the absent members.
Representative Peppin moves that further proceedings under the roll call be dispensed with and that the Sergeant at Arms be instructed to bring in the absent members. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motion prevails. Clerk will close the roll. Further discussion, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, I rise to support the Zerwas amendment. Members, this is the same amendment that I offered just 2 days ago. Members, Minnesota firefighters are grappling with this silent epidemic, and there has been many newspaper articles that are starting to come out. The Star Tribune wrote an article just April 19th of 2018 talking about how researchers estimate that anywhere between 7 to 37% of firefighters have PTSD, yet the work culture overwhelmingly views treatment as a sign of weakness. Also, there was an article just recently in the USA Today. It was written on April 11th of 2018, showing that the silence can be really deadly, and that while 46 officers were fatally shot last year, more than triple of that, 140 committed suicide. Members, this is a very serious issue. I ask for your support for the Zerwas amendment, and Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a roll call.
Roll call being requested, and seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm also rising to support Representative Zerwas's amendment. I don't want to beat it to death, but I did work at the security hospital, and I am 63 now. And the list of guys that I worked with that are my age and younger that are already dead is amazing. Big, strapping guys that have died, and anxiety, stress, and PTSD are what I blame. I have asked the legislative auditor to do a study on what the life expectancy of a security counselor is. When I was there, they figured it was 57. One of the reasons I'd really like to see the pension bill move forward. In the correctional field, the standard that they feel is that most correctional officers actually collect 18 checks before they die. Again, PTSD. Personally, we're at the 20th anniversary of the tornado in St. Peter. The gentleman that was the chief deputy for the Nicollet County Sheriff's Office was the first one to get to the 6-year-old that was buried in the mud that died, and tried to revive him. That was the end of his career. He could not continue. I've also known of a couple of police officers that had to draw their weapons and kill people in the line of duty, and that was the end of their careers. The stress and tension that people in public safety, in the security counselors, in the correctional fields, that they go through on a daily basis is amazing. The levels of anger and anxiety, until you have spent time, and it builds up over the years. But when you've actually faced death, when you have seen people maimed and injured, and you've seen it repeatedly, it affects you. And thank you, Representative Zerwas, for bringing this forward. We need to take care of these people, and we need to have strategies to intervene on an earlier time frame so that we aren't looking at funerals and death, that we are looking to protect these folks. Thank you.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Mahoney moves to amend the Zerwas Amendment to Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended. And the amendment to the amendment is coded A42.
Recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney, to your amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the members, this amendment has two folds to it. What it does is it gets rid of the Work Comp Advisory Council. They are not doing their job. And it gives me a platform, the biggest platform I have, to speak to you, to speak to the people of Minnesota about the Work Comp Advisory Council. What Representative Zerwas did not talk about is that this issue has been in front of the Work Comp Advisory Council for over a year and a half. And in that time, someone in my district threatened themselves and their family because that man did not get help. This council, and I'm going after labor with this speech. I'm going after the chamber with this speech. I'm going after the cities, the counties, and all the people who have protected their own interests rather than helping working men and women. I think these people are despicable. Men and women who put their lives on the line, whether it is a police and fire person, an emergency room nurse, whether it is a prison guard, whether it is anyone who puts their life on the line for us, to have this group of 8 people not do their job, not be held accountable, is unbelievable. Barring the elimination of this committee, the governor should kick them all off and appoint new ones. To tell you a few stories, because my old seatmate Joe Atkins said I should always tell you a story. For the longest time, if you had a work comp claim, they had up to almost 800 days. 800 days, almost 2 years, or better than 2 years, to come to conclusion on it. I fought 2 years on that issue to get it down to 400. The Speaker Pro Temp and I arranged a deal to help workers get surgery faster when they need it, to have less paperwork when they do have surgery, to get the bills done faster, to get rid of the scrubbers that were holding these injured men and women with huge debt over their head when they're trying to recover. We differ on the length, but it took more than 2 years for them to come to an agreement to help injured workers. The people to blame for this is the chamber, is labor organizations, the organizations that represent the men and women that put their lives on the line for us, so they can protect their turf, so they can play politics, so they can say, what's in it for my group? Let them go talk to that woman whose husband held a gun to her head. I have protected this Work Comp Advisory Council for years. But they are not doing their job anymore, and they haven't done it for years. They have protected their own interest. These are big political groups that are protecting their interests and leaving the poor, injured, working stiff with debt hanging over their heads, untreated injuries, and no livelihood. It's the rare moment that you get to make your friends and your enemies mad on this floor. But I am proud to do that today. I hope every news organization, every TV station calls them on the carpet tomorrow. I can tell you stories that I've heard about all the injuries that this group of 8 people say they can't vote on because we don't have agreement. What's the problem with agreeing to help injured workers? The employers of this state pay a ton of money for workers' comp. And the principle behind workers' comp is to get that man or woman healed and back to work. And if it's PTSD, they know the best therapy for it. They know the general length of time for it. But what's in it for me? How do I protect my interest? These men and women that sit on that council should be ashamed. They should be fired. Members, I'm going to vote for this bill. I'm going to vote for your bill. And I'm going to sit in that conference committee and try and hold this particular bill, piece of legislation in that conference committee. And I hope this amendment goes on to prove how serious we as a body, not we as DFLers or GOPers, but we as a body stand up for injured workers as a whole. I've been injured on the job. Fortunately, not hard, not badly. But I know how hard it is to sit there for 3 weeks trying to figure out if I'm going to be able to go back to work, or how to live on the small amount of money that you get for living expenses. It is time for all those organizations that I mentioned earlier to put their pride, put their puffed up chest, and all the other crap that goes along with that aside and fix this. Fix this PTSD problem. I have gotten mounds of paper from each and every one of them telling me how much we are working on, how hard we are working on this. They're working that damn hard. They should have been able to figure this out in less than 2 years. Mr. Speaker, Representative Zerwak, great bill. Happy to vote for it. I hope you'll vote for my amendment.
Further discussion to the amendment to the amendment. The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members, I would rise in opposition to the amendment. First of all, while I certainly agree with many of the comments that Representative Mahoney has made, the Workmen's Comp Advisory Task Force has served us well and will continue to serve us well in the future. We can do both. We can keep that council in law, but we can also send a strong message today by adopting the underlying amendment. Secondly, members, there's a provision in Representative Mahoney's bill which he did not mention. He is referencing the 2-tier minimum wage also and deleting that for the bill. So I would ask members to vote no on this amendment.
Further discussion. Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I agree with Representative Mahoney that maybe it is time to disband the WCAC. After attending nearly a year of meetings, and with this issue in front of the Work Comp Advisory Council for 18 months, Representative Mahoney, I don't know how many presentations we sat through by trauma specialists from Regions, North Memorial, the University of Minnesota, that month after month told that council, yes, this is real. Yes, it can destroy lives. Yes, it is caused by the day in and day out trauma and hardship and stress. that the men and women in uniform see on a daily basis. We had a fantastic presentation at one of the hearings, Representative Mahoney, that you may recall, in which the individual with a PhD, he's a trauma specialist, and he talked about post-traumatic stress as an individual having a bucket, and their bucket gets filled up day after day as they go to fire calls and they go to these medicals, and you're a police officer and you're involved in this domestic assault, or you deal with this child sex victim, and your bucket gets filled up, and your bucket gets filled up. And over a career, members, it destroys you. In many cases, for many officers, for many firefighters, over a career, the trauma destroys you. And after that presentation, and multiple presentations like it, we came together before session started. And we had what I figured was even a compromise position that said, focus on treatment first. And if and only if treatment doesn't work and the person is still deemed by the physician unable to return to work, then the presumption would kick in. And they still said, no, no. They were having none of it. And so 18 months in of listening to presentations and sitting across the table each other, and they're right, they're playing chicken. And meanwhile, members, people are dying. People are dying. And so I love the portion of your amendment that disbands the Work Comp Advisory Council. However, because of the wage amendment that you're trying to pull out of the bill, Representative Mahoney, I can't support your amendment to the amendment. But if in conference you want to do just the disbanding of the Work Comp Advisory Council, I would strongly urge my members to accept that language on its own.
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, did I ask for a roll call?
Representative Mahoney, there is not a roll call yet requested on your amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, I fully intended to withdraw my amendment that disbands the Work Comp Advisory Council. They don't deserve to sit on that council after a year and a half. So no, I would ask for a roll call, and I do not plan on withdrawing this amendment.
A roll call being requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The member from Clearwater, Representative Grossel. The member from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe it was Representative Gunther who wanted to speak to this.
The member from Martin, Representative Gunther.
Mr. Speaker, since Representative Mahoney withdrew his amendment, I have nothing else to say.
Representative Gunther, he requested a roll call.
He requested a roll call. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have Representative Mahoney yield.
He will yield. Representative Gunther.
Representative Mahoney, I'm not sure what you're trying to do with the minimum wage for small business. Could you describe what you're trying to do?
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, my amendment doesn't have anything to do with small businesses' wages. This is simply removes the language that authorizes the Work Comp Advisory Council.
Representative Gunther.
Mr. Speaker, could I talk to Representative Garofalo.
Are you requesting a yield?
Yield to Representative Garofalo.
He will yield. Representative Gunther.
Thank you, Representative Gunther. Yeah.
Representative Garofalo.
Just Mr. Speaker and members and Representative Mahoney, I'm pointing to page, on the A42 amendment, page 1, line 10, there are two separate repealers in there. The second repealer is 177.24 subdivision 2. And I can read it for members, but what it does is it removes the statutory prohibition on employers being able to determine tips as wages. That's what that subdivision does. So I'm not going to give you, that's what that provision does. I don't know. We've been trying to figure out for a day what you were trying to do, Representative Mahoney, even, so that might explain it. But that's what that second repealer does.
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, it would take me a moment to take a look at the bill, but I'm told that that was already in the bill. So,
Representative Garofalo.
Yes, Mr. Speaker and members, that is correct. So members voting on this amendment would be voting to disband the Workers' Comp Advisory Task Force, and they would also be voting to repeal the current prohibition on employers being able to determine that tips are part of their wages.
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, that's a really good idea to remove the tip penalties, but if the body will give me the leeway to remove, you say it's 177.24? Mr. Speaker, I'll divide the amendment.
Representative Mahoney, where would you like to divide the amendment?
So between, what is that? No. Mr. Speaker, I would divide
Representative Mahoney.
I would divide the amendment on page 1, line 10, after the first semicolon,
Representative Mahoney, the amendment as you have requested is not divisible after the colon.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative Mahoney.
would I be able to divide the amendment between 1.8 and 1.9?
Representative Mahoney, the amendment to the amendment is divisible between lines 1.8 and 1.9.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's my motion, and I would like to take the first half of the amendment first.
Members, Representative Mahoney is dividing his amendment to the amendment, and he has requested that we consider the first part of the amendment, lines 1.1 through line 1.8. To your representative, would you wish to speak to that first part?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is my motion. I don't think my blood pressure will take another speaking to this amendment. Mr. Speaker, would I need to ask for a roll call on that particular piece of the amendment?
Representative Mahoney, the roll call holds true for both parts of the divided amendment. Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And again, I would ask for a no vote on this, members. But I assume we're voting, Mr. Speaker, a parliamentary inquiry. We're voting on the first half of the amendment. Is that correct?
Representative Garofalo, we are taking a roll call vote on the first part of the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members, so I would urge a no vote on it. In the first half of this amendment, as Representative Mahoney has laid out, we would be deleting Section 9 from page 213 of the bill. This is an enabling statute that if we took out would cause a conflict with the two-tier minimum wage. So by doing it this way, it is now deleting the two-tier minimum wage from the bill. If we were to adopt the first half of the amendment and then Representative Mahoney were to withdraw the second half of the amendment, you'd be taking it out of the bill. So members, I would ask for a no vote on this on the first half of the A42 amendment.
Discussion to the divided amendment. The member from Martin, Representative Gunther.
Mr. Speaker and members, I also was on a Work Comp Advisory Council, and I had a constituent of mine that was getting Social Security disability insurance from the federal government with no problem, but he could not get help with his injuries from the Work Comp Advisory Council, and I got out of that council because of that. And I totally agree that it should be disbanded and changed completely or something, but we got to get rid of it because they are not functioning and haven't for a long time.
Further discussion, Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to ask a question I know better. If you look at this particular amendment, all I am asking is that we remove the statutory language that includes the Work Comp Advisory Council. I am not, and I don't know how that could possibly affect a two-tier wage when all I am doing is removing the Work Comp Advisory Council. I don't know how you're reading this particular bill that way. If we pass the second half, you're correct. But that's a separate vote.
Further discussion. Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would encourage you to vote no on both pieces of the Mahoney amendment. I understand the frustration that the Workers' Comp Advisory Council hasn't done the work in some cases that Representative Mahoney thinks that they should do. And I hear the frustration, but I don't think that this is the proper way to deal with the problems that exist. And I would encourage members to vote no.
Further discussion. The member from Scott, Representative Lunan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the point of Representative Mahoney and the work comp situation, in all other types of insurance, we have safeguards in for the plaintiff, the covered personnel, from a timeline standpoint for a sense of fairness. Work comp has a whole different set of rules, and there are a lot of problems in there that are affecting very real people. And it needs to be taken a look at. One of the causes of that problem is people who are abusing the work comp situation, and it causes two problems. First of all, the one that Representative Mahoney articulated is exactly right. You have a very jaundiced judge of whether or not you are entitled to benefits, and what exasperates that even more is how long it takes them to make that decision, and that's problematic. An even more frustrating situation that I see in my industry is people who have valid claims and are concerned with being labeled into that group and do not want to come forward with the claims and the coverage they need to take care of the problems they have. So this is a problem. I'm concerned about removing the council at this point because of the vacuum it would create and what it would replace, but I support and I agree with the problem that Representative Mahoney is talking about and would eagerly volunteer to help work on improving that problem.
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anyone here has any doubt how I feel about the Work Comp Advisory Council and their work. I hope I've made a good enough argument that you would support this if the there weren't some concerns with this particular bill that Representative Garofalo has articulated. I'll use this as a message to the Work Comp Board. They cannot take 2, 3, and 4 years to figure out a problem. But you know what? They will. They will until we decide to have a long, bloody fight on this floor about how we reform it. And we will not be friends when it's done, according to history of this particular institution. Because the last time that we did this, when one group had control of the body, we did significant work comp changes. And when we didn't, when the other side of the aisle had control, they did significant changes. This system worked well for a long time. It is not working for workers any longer. And we should, as legislators to this state, seriously look at how we change it or force the issue. I will reluctantly withdraw this amendment, and I encourage all members to vote for Representative Zerwak's bill.
Representative Mahoney withdraws the A42 amendment. Members, we return to the underlying A24 amendment. Further discussion. Representative Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker and members, I would urge every member of the chamber to vote in favor of the A24 amendment.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I want to say thank you to Representative Mahoney. Your passion, I share it. Thankfully, right now, I don't share your blood pressure. I do want to speak in favor of this amendment. I'm not going to share war stories or horror stories, but I will say this. It's not only the employees, the people that are suffering from prolonged post-traumatic stress events, but it's their families. It's their kids, it's their wives, it's their extended family. So please vote for this. This is not perfect. It's a step in the right direction. I traveled all over the state. Most of you know that for other reasons. But last summer when I was in central Minnesota, I was at a big fire district meeting where some of you were there with me. And the number one issue that came forward from about 30 different fire departments, and these were all volunteer fire departments, was they need help with this because the local bar isn't cutting it. So folks, members, we've got an opportunity to make a real positive change, so please support the Zerwas amendment.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson B.
Members, we talked about this the other day. I have a tough time with this because I have friends, I could almost say I have friends with me. It's the memories and the scars those memories have on me. From doing CPR on a 1.5-year-old boy who drowned, to burying a number of my friends. Those scars never go away. Law enforcement community, the fire community, the EMS, we used to have some ways we dealt with it. Unfortunately, some policies that were put in place, we no longer can do those things. See, people complain when they see 3 squad cars at the coffee shop. People complain because we're too many of us together at one place. Those officers that we work with are a part of our family. They're the only ones that we can talk to deal with this issue. That's how we used to deal with it. Now we can't do that. We can't bring it home to our families. They don't know how to deal with that. So part of the problem we've caused amongst ourselves, and this is an issue I did not want to share on the floor, but I thought I had to. Because it's the public is forcing the administration to put rules in that we can't have lunch together as our group, that we can't have coffee together. But when they work in their factories and their assembly plants, when that bell goes off, they all go to the lunchroom as friends and then complain when law enforcement does that. But I also understand why Representative Mahoney had that amendment. And I agree with them. They're not doing their job. And it's not just on this issue. I have a number of friends in the law enforcement community that were injured, that needed surgery for a knee, a shoulder. After 12 months of doing the therapy, they finally get down to and have the surgery that was set, they were told needed in the first place. But workers' comp makes them go through a year's worth of stuff being off the road, off work, doing other things. And it's unfair to the people they work with because they have to take up the slack, which causes more problems because they're away from their families. They're dealing with more stress because of the overtime. Because the workers' comp, the way it's set up, they can't get the help they need. So Representative Mahoney, you talked about redoing the system. If you're willing, I'm willing, let's work together on it. And I'll help you as much as I can. Members, vote however you like on this. But we need to tell the Workers' Comp Advisory Board, get your job done.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. Thank you, Representative Mahoney, for your continued work on this and other issues. Thank you to Representative Hillstrom for offering this amendment the other night and working with me. Members, I know that the language we have in front of us today isn't perfect. This is the language that last year in the other body was adopted on the workers' comp bill by a unanimous vote in the other body. My hope is that with a strong vote over there and a strong vote of support over here, we send a clear signal to the counties, to the cities, to the chamber, to the Teamsters, to LELS, and all of the other groups at the table. We expect you to figure this out. You need to get this done. The only way I can guarantee more people are unhappy with how this ends up, and Representative Mahoney alluded to it in his amendment, is if we have to fix it. Members, I urge a green vote.
A roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the A24 amendment. Member, House is under call. Members, the House is under call. Please vote.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Pippin.
Mr. Speaker, I move that those not voting be excused from voting.
Pippin moves that those not voting are excused from voting. Excuse me. Those not voting are excused from voting. Third time. All those in favor?
Mr. Speaker, is that a debatable motion?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Clerk will close the roll. There being 124 ayes and 0 nays, the A24 amendment is adopted.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Pinto, for what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the call of the House be lifted.
All those in favor say aye. All opposed, nay. Motion does not prevail.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative Pippin.
I move that the call of the House be lifted.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The motion prevails. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Runbeck moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A26.
I call upon the member of the author of the amendment, Representative Runbeck, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, this amendment before you proposes a study of the preparedness of Minnesota's electric power grid in the event of electromagnetic pulse attacks, whether they be from natural phenomena such as solar flares or severe storms, or whether they be from man-made attacks. And this study would be a good first step in really understanding the vulnerabilities of our electric power grid and really what actions need to be taken by all the stakeholders, including the utilities, as well as how emergency planners can anticipate and prepare for a potential life-threatening event. We've heard a lot this session about cybersecurity and the existential threat that it represents in many ways to our state. But in the same way, the security of our electric power infrastructure needs to be addressed, needs to be studied in a coordinated fashion, and it needs to come from government. Who benefits from this study? Certainly the lawmakers, because we need information, we need good information, we need independent information, but as well the utilities themselves, the medical community, hospitals, public safety, the National Guard, and really everyone who would be confronted with the widespread fallout from a broad major power outage that lasts for any length of time. We join a number of other states, about a dozen other states, who are concerned about this and about the risks and are seeking similar legislation. This would be a timely study on a subject that deserves state government's attention, and I do urge your support.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Runbeck is moving to amend her amendment to Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended. And the amendment is coded A45.
Representative Runbeck, to the amendment, to your amendment.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the amendment merely changes the source of the funding for the study.
Discussion to the amendment to the amendment. The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker and members, I support the amendment to the amendment and urge members to vote in favor of it.
Further discussion to the amendment to the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Motion prevails. The amendment to the amendment is adopted. To the amendment as amended, Representative Runbeck, Chair Runbeck.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I just urge support for this. Passed out a recent article that talks about some of the experiences in 3 cities last spring where looked like it was coordinated, looked like it was something that was organized, but actually these were power outages that occurred because of some solar flares that happened in San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. And really the fallout is tremendous, even from a fairly simple and localized failure. So we need to understand more, and we need to be ready to bring the state into some direction giving here in this area. Thank you.
Discussion to the amendment as amended. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. Solar flares and the resulting electromagnetic pulses are real, but our utilities already know about these, and they have the preparedness steps that you're asking for. So with the study that you're asking for, with $50,000, will not add to our preparedness. It's just money that is going to be spent without making us safer or stronger, and I would urge folks to vote no.
Discussion to the amendment as amended. The chairman, Chairman Garofalo from Dakota.
Mr. Speaker, 2 things. 1, there's 11 grams of sugar in 1 bowl of Captain Crunch. And 2, I would urge members to adopt the amendment as amended. Thank you.
Further discussion. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Earlier during the debate, we had discussion about going on trips. And I actually have been at some NCSL trips, and I've heard this before, this amendment before. It keeps reoccurring over and over and over again. I think there was a representative from Maine who brought it for consideration each year for other states to do this. And Representative Garofalo, I see you. I think you were at those meetings too. I think you've heard it before. And there. Coming from Maine. Solar flare. I think Representative Wagenius was right. Do you really believe that the Department of Defense hasn't considered this? Do you really believe that your utilities haven't looked at this and that this is going to add something? Representative Runbeck, would you yield for a question?
She will yield. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Runbeck, have you talked with anybody on the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, regarding this?
The lady from Anoka, Chair Runbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Hansen. I have not spoken with them. I have spoken with people who have been studying this issue for the better part of 10 years, who've made multiple trips to Washington, who've been at many, many conferences. I mean, literal experts in this field who feel like there's not enough information that is being acted upon. Congress has known about this. The Department of Defense has known about it for 60 years, 50 years. But they were always interested in it from the military standpoint, military equipment, and so on. We are more interested, I think, as we should be, about the civil infrastructure issue that is brought here. So these individuals have tried to get the studies, tried to get information. It seems that you've got national information that's not state-specific. You have power company information that is individual by individual company. It's not state-specific. Our state government needs to have a handle on where we need to go. This is going to give us some across the board, some comparative information, very minimal start to it. So we're all operating from something we can understand and take from that point.
Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment as amended. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Representative Hansen. You didn't ask me if I had talked to anyone in the administration, but I did talk to the Department of Commerce about this. And they say, yes, our utilities are well aware. They have made the steps for preparedness. This is local. This is not the Department of Defense. And a $50,000 study is not going to add to our preparedness. So in this case, I would say this is not money well spent, and I'm going to vote no.
Discussion to the amended amendment. Further discussion. All in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
O'Neill moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A31.
The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. So I've been meeting with the stakeholder groups about the provision that's in the bill. This amendment is offering greater consumer protections, and this is about Xcel Energy and bringing some of their proposals to the PUC before they have all of their expenditures and before they spend all the money, so they can have that conversation. But what this amendment actually does is, instead of having the advanced determination of prudence, which was in the underlying bill, this amendment would change that to a rebuttable presumption of prudence, which means not only before the expenditures would be spent, but also after the expenditures would be spent. There would be a look at all of those expenses. The presumption would not be prudent and would carry through, would not, if the operations are beyond the expiration of the operating license. 2, it would, if it was modifying the capacity of the facility, or 3, if the termination of the operation is before the operation license is expired. Also, members, it also changes that after the utilities expenses are made, there is this second review of prudency of the expenses, but it shifts the burden to those parties challenging that expense. So instead of Xcel Energy defending their expenses, in the second look at it, it would be the party that brought the concerns. There's also an additional provision, if you look at paragraph E, that the presumption of prudency does not extend to expenses that are made after the facility has been ordered to be closed. That's a different process that they would be going through. And the final provision in my amendment is in paragraph F. And it clarifies that the PUC has the sole discretion, again, the PUC has the sole discretion to approve or reject any costs that are in excess of the expenses that have been presumed to be prudent. The utility bears the burden of proof for all of these expenditures that would exceed the costs that were agreed upon before they expend. So that is the amendment, members, and I ask for your support.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Swazinski moves to amend the O'Neill amendment to Senate File 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A50.
The gentleman from Lyon to the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. This amendment is being put forward because there's a large amount of wind development in rural Minnesota. That development has done a lot of good for our rural communities. This amendment really talks about aircraft detection lighting systems, or ADLS. It's really a new concept. About 2 years ago, the FFA provided some guidance documents for the regulation of radar-activated lighting technologies. This is essentially, it's the technologies that are integrated with large wind developments. So when they go up, the lights only come on when plane is in the air. So, you know, a lot of folks benefit, a lot of developers benefit, a lot of landowners benefit from these developments. But oftentimes, folks that live near are left with what's left, and that's a light that comes on and off, on and off. And I've heard from constituents, and that's why this is before us today, about this technology. North Dakota, just this last year, has mandated on the industry that this would move forward in all upcoming and moving projects that are going forth in North Dakota. And also, I think in 2021, all current projects within the state will be retrofitted. There are some concerns with how that will be done moving forward. The state of Wyoming, there's a 30 megawatt generation unit in Wyoming that is completely put under this new technology. I really wanted to have that conversation on behalf of my constituents, but also from an education standpoint from members of this body. How important it is to be looking at new technologies and really encouraging the industry as a whole to really embrace this. I don't feel maybe a mandate right at this point in time, this early in the technology. The cost is a bit high yet, but really looking at that from a community perspective of how those folks are going to be impacted and those sunsets that aren't going to be seen. And with that, I believe there is a little bit of an issue with the germaneness to this amendment to Representative O'Neill's work, so I would like to withdraw it. Thank you.
Well, Representative Swedzinski, I would decide that. Oh, withdrawn? Okay, the amendment to the amendment has been withdrawn. To the amendment, the gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative O'Neill, for not only this amendment, but also for all the work you've been putting in on a exceptionally complicated issue. The members of the committee know we spent an exhaustive amount of time on this issue, so thank you for the changes you've made to address many of the concerns that the opponents of this have brought forward. I would urge members to support the O'Neill A31 amendment.
Discussion to the amendment. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative O'Neill, this amendment doesn't cure the two very basic problems in the underlying bill. What the bill does, members, is set up a scheme that allows Excel to justify, or to avoid justifying, the costs of continuing to upgrade and operate its nuclear plants, and justify that cost is less than comparable alternatives. So that's one problem with the bill, the underlying bill. It's not cured by this amendment. The second one is the bill then allows shareholders to be held harmless if there are cost overruns for new capital improvements. So if the shareholders are held harmless, then of course it's the ratepayers who are going to pay. This amendment actually makes it crystal clear that the ratepayers are going to pay. Just look at lines 2.9 and 2.10. Ratepayers will pay for cost overruns. So the amendment isn't the problem. The language in the bill is. And it's a big problem, members, because 4 years ago, Excel upgraded its nuclear plants, the 3 nuclear plants, at a cost of over $400 million. Oh, it's this one up here. This bill is a double whammy for ratepayers, and from my point of view, it's a poison pill in the bill and another reason to vote the whole bill down.
Discussion to the amendment. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a couple of questions for the author, Representative O'Neill.
She will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
So on line 11 and 111 and a number of other parts of the amendment, you refer to a carbon reduction facility. Could you define exactly what a carbon reduction facility is?
The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and Representative Hornstein. It's actually in the underlying bill. And if you look at 162.14, It defines what the qualifying facility is, and there is a definition there.
The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One additional question. Why would you define the facility in such a way?
She will yield. The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. It is recognizing that there is no carbon emissions from a nuclear power plant.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
So, thank you again. One last question then. So, are you suggesting that climate change is a real phenomenon that needs to be addressed and caused by people?
Are you asking the lady to yield?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes.
The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, I'm not acknowledging anything. I'm just saying that if we're going to talk about carbon, which we do often here, especially in the Energy Committee, and you're not with us right now on the Energy Committee, but we do talk about carbon emissions quite a bit. In fact, one part that we do have in the bill, which I find really fascinating, is the goal of Xcel Energy to get to 85% carbon-free emissions. And this is in so keeping with the nuclear power plant, since they are carbon-free emissions, this is part of their overall plan. And so we are acknowledging that.
Further discussion? The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, members, I just wanted to call members' attention to a letter I just had handed out from the Department of Commerce, which talks about this portion of the underlying bill and actually does a nice job of looking at all of the pieces of the underlying bill that are a problem.
Discussion. The lady from Wright, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I just wanted to address a couple things in my closing. The things that Representative Wagenius was concerned about is actually addressed when they do the integrated resource plan. And I know that this is very complicated policy, and there's just a handful of folks in here that understand the depth of this energy policy, but it is the concern she raised in the first part of her question or concern was it's actually resolved in the integrated resource plan that is an extensive process of deciding collectively what Xcel Energy will be doing in the years ahead. Also, when she said the stakeholders are held harmless, that's actually not in the bill. There is a great deal of consumer protection. Again, there is an entire look at all of the expenses before they expend all those expenditures, and again, a look after they expend all these expenditures. So there is quite a bit of oversight there. And in regards to the cost overruns that we keep hearing about, I just want to remind members that that is during the time that Fukushima happened and the National Regulatory Commission, so the NRC came and told them they had to do all these additional things. So that was federal requirements that they had to make sure that they adhered to, and those were all really important expenditures to make sure that they were in compliance with all the federal regulations. Thank you, members, and I ask for your support.
Discussion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Metza moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second Grossman as amended, and the amendment is coded A35.
The gentleman from St. Louis, to your amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This amendment is to guarantee paid family and medical leave for all Minnesota workers. I'm offering it today because all Minnesota families deserve the opportunity to care for themselves and their families during life's greatest high or lows. This is personal for me. I was lucky enough to work at a place that gave me both the time that I needed to care for both of my grandfathers in their last days. It gave me the opportunity to get my grandpa Elder popsicles and sweet treats. and to hear my Grandpa John say, remember, we all pray to the same God. And when my son Josiah was born last year, I had the privilege of staying at home with him for a precious few months in the early parts of his life. I could get up at night and see him, see those first little smiles, and check his fingers and toes and marvel every time I saw how perfect he was. Paid family and medical leave should be personal for all of us. No one in this room can argue that they haven't needed what this legislation provides at some point during their lives. But thousands of our constituents struggle every day to care for their loved ones because we haven't managed to get this done. To those who say it will hurt businesses, our Fortune 500 companies like Medtronic, Target, and 3M already provide these protections to families in other countries because those countries have prioritized their people over profits. We need to do the same and hold big corporations accountable to doing the right thing by their employees. It's long past time to pass this bill, and I hope I can count on your support.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Metza is moving to amend his amendment to Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A48.
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metza, to the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to request a roll call.
Roll call having requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metza, to the amendment to the amendment.
It's a really good amendment, members.
Discussion.
Mr. Speaker,
The gentleman from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
would Representative Metza yield to a question?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Representative Metza, would you explain what's in your amendment to the amendment, please, and what it does?
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metza.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Kresha. The amendment to the amendment actually changes some other statutes, a variety of them, that essentially provide data privacy for this law to be implemented. In lines 2.18 and 2.19, it makes sure that we are not providing paid family leave that is covered by an employer, and outlines in lines 3.8 through 3.12 or 3.12 that some changes in the language in regard to the children's age and things like that that are covered with exemptions to reference other statute. And let me keep going here. In lines 5.20 and 5.21, we form an administrative part of this, the Family and Medical Benefits Division of the Department of Employment and Economic Development, to be used as necessary to administrate the chapters that we're creating in these amendments, and essentially outline in section 16, 17, and 18 some of the rules in regard to how this works. In section 19, we go through how things are collected. And members, this works a lot like unemployment insurance, actually. And the reason that this is a good bill to pass is because Minnesota actually doesn't have a good temporary disability insurance program here. Target does offer it to many of their employees. However, what we found in working with small businesses and talking to our large corporate friends here in the state is that this will be very competitive in cost and provide their employees with way better benefits than they can get in the private market in the temporary disability insurance market. So this is something, again, members, that you get opportunities in life. that are human. What this bill allows you to do is experience something like I got to on top of the popsicles and sweet treats, Representative Creshaw. My grandfather was in the hospital. I lived with him after our first year of session here. And we ended up in a position where he had a do not resuscitate order, was moving on his way to hospice, and one night his breathing heavied. He ended up looking at me, I looked at him, and we knew it was his time to go. And he asked me with his eyes, what can you do to help? I asked him, is there anything I can do? And he said, will you crawl into bed with me? So I crawled into bed with my grandpa, and I rubbed his hair until the beep went steady. I walked out into the hall, started the family phone tree, called my dad, and about a minute after he was pronounced dead, we heard a beep. We kept going in the call. About 30 seconds later, the nurse had reassured me already. That's what happens to the body when you're going. And we hear another beep. So I turn around again and end the call with my dad. And my grandpa rockets straight out of bed about 30 seconds later and sits up, takes a huge gasp for air, someone with emphysema, and said, did you see those white sheets? And I said, no, but I know you did. He lived another month and a half and was able to say goodbye to all the other friends and family who hadn't had a chance to fly in and see him. That's what got me started on this legislation, members. The most human things. And then you have a baby. Last year, Representative Garofalo, thank you for letting me skip some committee. I was able to get a lot of my work done here, and I'm proud of that, with taking the time off that I was able to during the legislative session. Josiah was born on February 11th. And my wife ended up having a C-section. It got infected. She couldn't lift up more than our child. The reason people need this is because as her spouse, as her husband, it's my job to be there for her. And it's our job to make sure that employees in businesses all across this state can be there for their families in that way. We don't have protections like this in law. We're one of the only industrialized nations in the country. It's so inexpensive to get this done. We had a tax credit bill up in committee, and when we did the math on the number of babies born in Minnesota a year and the cost of this legislation compared to the cost of a tax credit, this was less expensive. It's our obligation to make sure that other parents having kids get these benefits. That if you're taking care of a parent or grandparent as they age, that you can leave work and come back. It's 12 weeks. 12 weeks where you can leave work, come back, and get a partial wage replacement and have your job, so that then you can continue to care for your own family or yourself. So I hope if this doesn't make it on today, and that when I'm not here next year, that this body works on legislation like this that raises people up and gives more opportunity to more families wherever they live, whatever they vote for, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, because issues like this aren't partisan. They're human issues. Thank you.
Discussion to the amendment, the gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Metsa. That's one of the classiest and finest speeches I've heard in my years serving here with you. Good job. So now I get to ask you questions. Real fun for me. Would you yield to a question?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Metsa, on the A48 amendment to the amendment, I'm looking at page 8. This is going to be section 19 of the bill, subdivision 2. As I read this, it appears to be that this is a payroll tax on every single employee in the state of Minnesota, whether they have paid leave already or not. Is that a correct assessment of what this subdivision does?
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metsa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Chair Garofalo. This does establish a payroll tax similar to unemployment insurance, yes.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
So, Mr. Speaker and members, if we were to go forward with this amendment to the amendment, people who already have paid leave, single parents who have paid leave, regardless of their income, are now going to face a tax increase to pay for other people's paid leave. If you would yield, is that a correct statement, Representative Metsa?
He will yield. The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metsa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Chair Garofalo. Actually, I would say that it's a tax decrease because you are able to collect some income during those times that you would need it.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, members, the point is that for those who have paid leave already, this still is going to levy a payroll tax on them. This is still, regardless of income, there's no progressivity to it. Anyone who has any earned income in the state of Minnesota under these qualifying provisions will be facing a tax increase.
The gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Metsa. Okay. The gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knoblach.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to a point of order under Rule 3.22, and I'm prepared to offer advice.
State your point of order. Advice.
Mr. Speaker, if you look at 3.22, subsection B, it says an amendment to an amendment may not increase a tax or a fee unless the underlying amendment increases the tax or fee in question. And as you've just heard in the discussion with Representative Metsa, on page 8 of the amendment to the amendment, we are establishing a new payroll tax on all employers and thus employees in the state, a new tax that we don't have, a new tax that hasn't existed before. If you look at the underlying amendment, there's no discussion, there's no new tax in there. And so I would ask, Mr. Speaker, that you find my point of order well taken.
Advice to the Speaker. After hearing advice from Chairman Knoblach, the point of order is well taken. To the amendment. Discussion.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order for, please state your point of order and offer advice.
I rise to House Rule 3.21, motions must be germane. Advice?
Advice.
Mr. Speaker, as you look at this amendment, it's adding a new section of statute 268B.01. When you look in the title of the bill, no such provision is part of this legislation. Therefore, this amendment is not germane to the bill.
Advice. Advice to the Speaker, the gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, advice.
State your
I guess
advice.
you did. Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'll point out that it would take someone quite a while to read the title of the bill. It goes on for multiple pages. As has been pointed out previously, this bill contains many, many different topics, and it absolutely relates to workforce, to families, to a number of issues that are designated in the amendments being offered, Mr. Speaker. I'll point out that in previous rulings by the Speaker, we've found germaneness based on a relation of similar topics, and I'll note that simply adding a new section, if that's the test on its own, then a number of amendments would not apply. The question is, would not be found to be germane. The question is, does it relate substantially to the underlying bill? And of course, with the wide variety of topics regarding jobs, et cetera, that are addressed in the underlying bill, this clearly is germane. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask that you find the point of order not well taken.
Thank you, Representative Pinto. Further advice? After listening to advice from Chair Anderson S. and Representative Pinto, I find that the point of order is well taken. There is an amendment to the desk. The clerk will report the amendment. Wagenius moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A37. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, there's $2 million in this bill, $2 million of renewable in the renewable development account. Renewable development account, keep that in mind, that is being given to Xcel Energy to manage nuclear waste. Pretty ironic, I would say. So I am taking that $2 million and instead using it for schools to become more efficient, or energy efficiency. And so this amendment specifically helps both taxpayers, because if you can become, a school can become more energy efficient, then taxpayers will not be spending as much money year after year after year for electricity. And of course, it helps the students because that money can be repurposed. So how much money are we talking about here? When I was doing some math on a proposal for solar in schools, I got the number of schools from House Research and used a high school in my district, or in Minneapolis, a middle school and an elementary school. And the high school spends $274,000 a year, that was 2017, on electricity. I thought that was a lot of money. The middle school spends $146,000 a year, and the elementary, the K-3, spends $63,000. So I was able to take those numbers and knowing the number of schools in the state, able to make an estimate of how much money we spend as taxpayers on electricity for schools. And the number I came up with was over $220 million a year. Wow. So with that in mind, I am proposing conservation for schools that would be grants that would be done by the Department of Commerce.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Wagenius moves to amend her amendment to Senate File 3656, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A38.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius, to your amendment to the amendment.
Yes, on this amendment to the amendment, I would like a roll call, Mr. Chair.
Roll call having requested are the 15 hands, seeing 15 hands. There will be a roll call. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Essentially, what I do in this amendment to the amendment is add the opportunity
Excuse me, Representative Wagenius. The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I do in the amendment to the amendment is add the opportunity for a school to also add solar. So that has a couple of added benefits for the schools in Minnesota that have added solar. There are not very many, but for the ones that have, teachers, physics teachers, electric shop teachers use the solar as a teaching tool. They highly recommend that. And if we can, in this day and age, we're using public-private partnerships. The amount put forth for any solar installation per school will be relatively small. And with that, I would appreciate your support.
Discussion to the amendment the gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Wagenius, I have concerns with the A38 amendment, but I'm more concerned about the underlying amendment. So I'll just urge members to vote in favor of it. You can withdraw your roll call.
The lady from Hennepin.
I would appreciate a yes vote on the underlying amendment to provide the opportunity for schools to have solar and energy efficiency. And with that, schools would save money that could be used for teachers and books, other things, and we would also have solar as a teaching opportunity. And I'd appreciate your yes vote on the underlying amendment.
Representative Wagenius, do you wish to withdraw the roll call? Okay, we will go ahead. Further discussion. We have a roll call requested. Further discussion on the amendment to the amendment. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment to the amendment. Members, please vote on the amendment to the amendment. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 73 ayes and 52 nays, the amendment to the amendment is adopted. To the amendment as amended, the lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members, for voting for the amendment to the amendment. I would like a roll call on the amendment as amended.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, members. I would appreciate a yes vote.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Wagenius yield for a question?
She will yield. The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Wagenius, as the author of the amended amendment, you know this already, but what you would be doing is you'd be delaying the opportunity to get the spent nuclear fuel out of Minnesota into an interim facility out of state. My question is, have you spoken with the Prairie Island Indian community or the city of Monticello about this amendment, which would delay the transfer of the spent nuclear fuel out of their locations?
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad you brought that question up, Representative Garofalo. Members, I would look at the amendment or the original language that Representative Garofalo had. In committee, we were told that Excel would be looking at sending nuclear waste to Texas and I think New Mexico. But that's not the way the amendment was drafted. It could be spent on work to send nuclear storage sites in Minnesota. And I bring that up because, and I hope we will see a map in a minute, that before the time of many of you in the legislature, when nuclear waste repositories were first discussed, and before we talked about Yucca Mountain, Minnesota was considered one of the safest places to have nuclear waste. So you will be seeing a map coming around right now. And that shows in the United States where the safe places are, and in Minnesota where the safe places are. And so I think the whole issue of this amendment and do we want nuclear waste out of Minnesota, I think a lot of people do, I certainly do, but with the drafting of the amendment, that the original amendment that Representative Garofalo had, it doesn't say that this waste has to go out of state. It can go any place. This whole question should be a question for the PUC. This should be a question that is considered by the PUC before appropriating money for private parties. I think there's a huge legal question whether we can even use the money for private parties and to support their applications in other states. So with that, members, yes, I did look at that and think that if you were going to do this kind of thing in the future, we would have to have a much tighter amendment, and it should go to the PUC first.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Wagenius yield for another question?
She will yield. The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Representative Wagenius, I've had an opportunity to look at the map that you passed out. Do you realize that this source material is dated for when I was 11 years old?
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
I actually do, and granite hasn't changed since you were 11 years old.
Well, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
If Representative Wagenius would just yield for one more question.
She will yield. The gentleman from Dakota.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Wagenius, once again, I asked this in my first question. I'll ask it again. Have you spoken with either the city of Monticello or the Prairie Island Indian community And can you share with us whether they support or oppose the amendment that you're offering that would delay the transfer of the spent fuel out of the state?
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Well, you're making the assumption that what you have proposed would actually move it forward. I don't make that assumption at all.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Wagenius would yield for one more question.
She will yield. The
Mr.
gentleman
Speaker,
from Dakota.
Representative Wagenius, is it fair to say that you did not speak with either the city of Monticello nor the Prairie Island Indian community about this amendment?
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Yes, it's fair to say that, and I think it's also fair to say that the original language that you had was not tight enough to move us forward.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chairman Garofalo.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members, I realize that nuclear power can be controversial to some people, and some people have concerns with nuclear power, but something that I think we can all agree on is having these spent nuclear fuel casks in a floodplain within 100 yards of residences is a bad idea. And so working with stakeholders on this, the reason why we put these provisions in the bill is to make use of new federal guidelines that are going to allow us to move Minnesota to the front of the line to get the spent nuclear fuel out of Minnesota. Under the guidelines for a permanent federal repository, it was very structured and very structured in nature in terms of who gets to go first. And it would be many years, maybe even decades, before either Monticello or Prairie Island would get the opportunity to get these casks shipped out. However, now with the new interim facility locations, potentially in western Texas and eastern New Mexico, number one, they have local community buy-in and support for them. Number two, we can move ourselves to the front of the line to get that stuff out of here. So whether you're in favor of nuclear power, against nuclear power, we should all be in favor of getting the spent nuclear fuel out of our state. With regards to saying that the language isn't tight enough, and I guess I can't say that you're justified in opposing something because of what's not there. I mean, the language doesn't say you can't put it in a rocket and fire it into space. Okay, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say you can't bury it in Representative West's backyard. It doesn't mean those things are going to happen. They applauded burying nuclear waste in your backyard, Nolan. So members, I don't know why people would be advocating and putting them on the opposite side of both the city of Monticello and the Prairie Island Indian community. I don't know why. I don't know about the pro-keeping spent nuclear fuel constituency group in Minnesota. I would just urge all members to vote against this, and we can demonstrate to the federal regulators and to stakeholders that we do in fact want to get this stuff out of here as quickly as we can. Thank you.
To the amendment, the gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first statement is that this is a business expense and the shareholders should cover this. My second question, so 11 years old chronologically or psychologically? Because that would make it, you know.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you. I'm glad Representative Mahoney brought up the fact that this is a business expense and there's nothing in the amendment that precludes XL from expending its own money to look at other sites. As a matter of fact, it should have been doing it all along, and it didn't need legislation to do it.
Discussion to the amendment as amended. The gentleman from Washington, Chairman Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Carlson yield to a question?
Representative Carlson, which one?
Linden.
He will yield. The gentleman from Washington, Chairman Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Carlson, this has always been a very, very controversial thing in the legislature with the storage at Prairie Island of the spent nuclear material. And I think you might have some experience with the original controversial decision and how that came to pass. Could you talk a little bit about how that came to be and what might have been anticipated for the future and what that conference committee might think about this decision now?
Gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Carlson L.
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be hard to say what the conference committee perhaps would think about what's before us now, although there are two of us here in the House currently that were on the conference committee. I think the direction of your question is about the casks, and that original conference committee report authorized a limited number of casks. I'm thinking it was somewhere around 14, maybe 16 casks. It's been about 25 years, 1991, so I may be a little vague on the exact number of casks. The idea at the time was that those casks were temporary and that they were going to be moved to Yucca Mountain as soon as that site was prepared. As you may know, then the federal government made the decision to no longer develop Yucca Mountain, so it's at the very least on hold. But I do want to point out that at the time that conference committee was meeting, and it met over several weeks, it was a very contentious issue. There was a lot of concern and a lot of resistance to having any of that storage permanently located in the state of Minnesota. And as that map does show, there were potential sites. And so there was a lot of concern that we structure that in a way that the nuclear waste would not be stored in Minnesota. When you asked me that question, I was thinking of getting up and posing a question to Representative Garofalo as I was listening to the discussion between Representative Wagenius and Representative Garofalo about the language not being particularly tight in terms of where that storage might be. And the reading of Representative Wagenius was that it would be open to possibly being stored in Minnesota. And I just would point out that that was something that we didn't want to have happen, and that our view was that that was to be temporary at Prairie Island. Just a little side story while I'm up. When I was appointed to the conference committee, I asked the Speaker of the House at the time what kind of an outcome he was interested in relative to the storage issue. And he said, well, I know you have to reach a compromise, and that's what I'd like you to do, but please don't have any storage in Koochiching County. That probably gives you a little hint about the attitude of the Speaker of the House at the time and the district that he represented. But I think that had you asked any number of members in the legislature at that point, they probably would have said, don't have any of that storage in my district or in my county. So I point that out as he would be representative of probably the attitude in terms of what you were asking of the legislature at that point in time.
The gentleman from Washington, Chair Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion to the amendment as amended. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm very glad, Representative Dean, that you asked Representative Carlson those questions, because this history is very, very important. And the fact is, it was a limited number of casks. What Representative Carlson mentioned is absolutely correct. It was 14, and then we went up to 48 in 2003. That was my freshman year. And we keep adding these casks. And the real issue, the one that we're not addressing, is the fact that Yucca Mountain was nixed because it's not safe. And there's nowhere really to keep something safe for 10 million years when it's this hazardous. And so the logical thing to do, the safe thing to do, is to stop producing this in the first place. That's where we miss the mark when it comes to this kind of energy production. We keep producing the waste. There's no safe way to handle it. And instead of phasing these plants out at the rightful time that they should be phased out, what we're doing is prolonging them. And that's irresponsible. So the real issue here is the radioactivity of this nuclear byproduct, the waste, and that it's going to be around for 10 million years. And that's the problem.
Discussion to the amendment as amended. Roll call. I'm going to request to the clerk will take the roll on the amendment to the amendment. To the amendment as amended, excuse me. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 45 ayes and 80 nays, the amended amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment. The desk clerk will report the amendment.
McQuaid moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A20.
The lady from Dakota, Representative McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members.
Excuse me, Representative. Members, please take your conversations to the alcove or the back room or the parking garage. To the lady from Dakota, Representative McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is very simple. It is a deletion of a repealer, and it deletes the repealer that would repeal the language that says no employer may directly or indirectly credit, apply, or utilize gratuities towards payment of the minimum wage set by this section or federal law. The reason I would like to delete the repealer is because employers should not be able to substitute tips for their, in lieu of their responsibility to pay their employees. Tipped workers generally don't make that much money. They certainly don't make a ton of money. Freezing their wages is certainly not a thing that helps more families get by. But I would wonder if Representative Mahoney would yield to a question.
The gentleman will yield. The lady from Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And